Sandy Sturbaum went to bed on Saturday night after a barbecue with friends. It had been drizzling. Nothing about that evening in Naalehu felt like the beginning of anything at all. She lives above the coffee house where she works, on the main road of a town, small enough that everyone knows whose truck is parked where on the southern edge of Hawaii's Big Island. Rain in August, in that part of that island, is not news. At about 11 o'clock, she woke up to a sound she couldn't place. By the time she reached a window, every car on the street was sitting underwater. Logs were moving past the building in the dark, and so were roofs. Not pieces of roofing, not shingles peeled loose by wind. Roofs, still attached to what was left of the houses beneath them, drifting south of the highway toward the ocean, with the lights of the town reflecting off the water they floated on. The hurricane that did that never made landfall on Hawaii. It never officially arrived at all. Its eyewall stayed roughly 30 miles offshore, scraped past the southern tip of the island, and kept moving west into open Pacific. And it still took about 100 homes. That gap between what this storm was on paper and what it did to the ground under people's feet is the entire story, and it's a story that has now happened to Hawaii twice in 8 years. In the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through what happened hour by hour, why the strongest wind gust of the whole event was measured at almost 14,000 feet where nobody lives, and why the number everyone reported Category 1 was the least useful piece of information in the entire disaster. If you want the version of these events that doesn't stop at the headline, subscribe now, because this channel goes back to every one of these and tells you what the data actually said. Let's start on Friday, because on Friday this was still a forecast problem. Lala was the 9th named storm of the Central Pacific season, and for most of its life, it looked like it would do what storms out there almost always do, which is pass by at a polite distance and give Hawaii a weekend of surf. Then the track shifted north. That single adjustment put a strengthening system on a line that took it close enough to the Big Island to raise something Hawaii had not seen in years: a hurricane warning for Hawaii County. The last time any Hawaiian island was under a hurricane watch or warning at all was during Hurricane Douglas back in 2020. Grocery shelves emptied, gas lines stretched. The governor signed an emergency proclamation before the first serious rain band arrived, and the National Guard went to round-the-clock staffing. By early Saturday, Lala was already whipping the island's east side as a tropical storm, and the forecast said it would keep strengthening right up to its closest approach. It did. Sometime Saturday, maximum sustained winds climbed to 75 miles an hour, which is the exact threshold where a tropical storm becomes a hurricane, and not 1 mile an hour more, Category 1. The bottom rung of the Saffir-Simpson scale. On the mainland, that number describes a storm that peels shingles, drops branches, and knocks out power for a day or two. Then the mountains got involved. Early Saturday afternoon, instruments on top of Mauna Kea, the tallest mountain in the Pacific, a summit so high that the observatories up there sit above 40% of the atmosphere, recorded a gust of 154 miles an hour. That's roughly the speed at which a passenger jet lifts its wheels off a runway. Down at the elevations where people actually live, gusts ran between 50 and 90 miles an hour across the Big Island, across Maui County, and all the way up the chain into Oahu. In the Kau district on the island's southern flank, sustained winds reached around 80. Trees came down by the hundreds. On Oahu alone, the Honolulu Fire Department logged more than 600 weather-related calls by midday Sunday, including 147 separate reports of downed trees. And emergency crews across the islands moved more than 200 people to hospitals over the course of the event. 3 hospitals ended up running on generators. At around 5 o'clock Saturday evening, local time, Lala made its closest approach. The eyewall, the ring of the storm's most violent weather, the part that does the damage when a hurricane comes ashore, brushed the southern portion of the island from about 30 miles away. That's the moment the headlines were built around, and it's the moment that matters least. Because while the eyewall was going by offshore, the storm's rain bands were doing something to the island that has nothing to do with wind speed and everything to do with geography. Lala was moving slowly. It was carrying tropical moisture wrung out of some of the warmest water this stretch of ocean has held in living memory. And directly in the path of that moisture stood two volcanoes over 13,000 feet tall. Air that hits a wall like that has one direction left to go: up. And air that goes up cools. Air that cools cannot hold what it's carrying, so it drops it, all of it. In the same place, for hours, for as long as the storm keeps feeding moisture into the ramp. The island didn't block Lala. The island took a storm that was moving sideways and tilted it downward, and then held it there, aimed at the slopes above Kau. Here is what came down. More than 30 inches of rain fell in 24 hours. That is roughly 2 years of Los Angeles rainfall arriving in a single day. By Sunday, more than 42 inches had been measured on the Big Island's northern coast stand, a yardstick upright in your yard, and the water that fell would have swallowed it whole with a handspan to spare. 2-day totals surpassed 3.5 feet in some locations. 5 separate places in Hawaii recorded 35 inches or more. The single highest total wasn't even on the Big Island Kapalua over in Maui County, took 48 inches. Maui's mountainous interior saw up to 2 feet. Kauai, hundreds of miles up the chain from where any of this was supposed to matter, took up to 15 inches and had to close sections of its main coastal highway. In Kau, where the worst of it landed, the number was around 32 inches. Late Saturday, the National Weather Service issued something forecasters don't reach for casually, a particularly dangerous situation warning attached to a flash flood emergency on Hawaii Island. That phrasing exists for the small number of events where the agency has concluded that people are going to die if they don't move right now. By then, the water was already moving. What happens to 32 inches of rain on a mountainside is not what happens to 32 inches of rain on a plain. On flat ground, water spreads and sits. On the flanks of a shield volcano, water finds the gulches that millions of years of erosion carved into the rock, and every one of those gulches is a channel pointed downhill at the towns below. It doesn't arrive as a rising level. It arrives as a front, a wall of water carrying mud, boulders, whole ohia trees, and everything it has already collected from higher up. In Naalehu, that front crossed Highway 11 and cut the town off from Kona in one direction and Hilo in the other in the same hour. Floodwaters picked up homes on the Makai side of the highway, the ocean side, and floated them. The National Weather Service office in Honolulu confirmed 2 homes swept away outright. The county mayor, Kimo Alameda, said that night that several occupied homes may have been pushed off their foundations. Sturbaum, from her window, counted more than 10 houses moving. In Waiohinu, just up the road, a woman went outside to reach her car. The water caught her, pinned her, and carried her about 100 yards the full length of a football field, goal line to goal line along with her house. She was rescued. An elderly woman was pulled from one of the homes that washed away. Search and rescue teams from Civil Defense, the National Guard, and the Coast Guard went out into that. And they went out into conditions where the roads themselves had become the hazard. Rushing water, boulders sitting in the middle of highways, and visibility close to nothing. Overnight into Sunday, the infrastructure started to fail in ways that took hours to even discover. A section of Route 11 at Pahala simply left. Between mile marker 49.3 and 49.4, the roadway was gone, not cracked, not undermined, gone, although the bridge structure at that spot survived. Water pouring through the wreckage created what the governor later described as a new waterfall, where no waterfall had been on Saturday morning. In front of Kau Hospital, a massive retaining wall shifted, broke in two, and the highway gave way beside it. That last detail is the one that should stop you. Kau Hospital is one of the only medical facilities serving that end of the island. When the road failed, Pahala was isolated, and the hospital was isolated, with its staff who had come in Saturday stayed put, and the immediate problem became fuel, food and medication because there was no route in for any of it. By Sunday morning, Alameda counted 6 bridges in the Cow District that appeared destroyed or nearly destroyed. He used one word for what he was looking at: devastation. And in Naalehu, floodwater tore through a county cemetery and unearthed it. Headstones scattered, graves opened, at least one casket carried out of the ground and left in the debris field. I've covered a lot of these. That's the detail I haven't been able to put down. Let me sit with the wind question for a second, because it's the thing people get wrong about this storm and about the last one that did this to Hawaii. A Category 1 hurricane is defined by a single measurement: sustained wind speed between 74 and 95 miles an hour, averaged over 1 minute at a standard height. That's it. The scale says nothing about how much rain a storm carries, nothing about how fast it's moving, nothing about how long it will sit over you, and nothing whatsoever about what the land underneath it looks like. It was designed to estimate structural wind damage, and for that job, it works. For everything else, it's close to useless. And Governor Josh Green said it plainly on Monday after flying over the damage. The wind hurt roofs and dropped trees everywhere, but it was the flood and the mud and the rock that poured through Naalehu, Pahala, and Waiohinu that did the real harm. Homes across that district are sitting half buried in mud right now, and a number of them were unpermitted structures, informal housing, built by people at the edge of the island's brutal cost of living squeeze on land that was never engineered to shed that kind of water. Which raises the question I'd like you to answer in the comments, because I think about it every time one of these events lands somewhere with steep terrain. Have you ever lived somewhere where a minor storm did major damage because of the shape of the ground you were on? A hillside, a canyon, a valley floor? Tell me where and what happened. Those replies teach me more about this than the forecast discussions do. Now, why did Lala have that much water in it in the first place? Hawaii is supposed to be hard to hit. There are 2 reasons for that, and both of them failed at the same time. The first is geometry. The islands are small targets in an enormous ocean, and a storm has to thread a very fine needle to score a direct hit. That protection held. Lala missed. 1992 was the last time a hurricane made landfall in the state, when Iniki tore into Kauai as a Category 4. The second defense is thermal, and that one broke. Storms approaching Hawaii from the east normally run into a band of cooler water before they reach the islands, and cool water starves a hurricane of the fuel it needs. Matthew Rosencrans, the lead hurricane season forecaster at the National Weather Service, describes that cooler water and the steady trade winds as part of the reason the islands are usually spared. This year, the cool water wasn't there. A marine heat wave stretching from Hawaii's waters all the way east toward California has left the surface running about 3 degrees above average along the track Lala took. 3 degrees sounds trivial. It isn't. Sea surface temperature is the throttle on a tropical cyclone, and a few degrees of extra warmth across thousands of square miles of ocean is an enormous amount of additional energy available to any storm that crosses it. Lala crossed it and never hit the brake that usually stops storms from arriving at the islands intact. Sitting underneath that marine heat wave is the other half of the setup, an El Niño that forecasters are watching climb toward what they're calling potential super status. NOAA's Climate Prediction Center puts the odds at 90% or better that this event reaches strong or very strong intensity through the late summer and fall, and gives it a roughly 7 in 10 chance from October through December of exceeding the strength of every El Niño event on record going back to 1950. El Niño does 2 things that matter here. It warms the Central Pacific, and it weakens the vertical wind shear that would otherwise tear a developing storm apart. Phil Klotzbach, the hurricane researcher whose seasonal forecasts are a fixture of this field, put it simply in an interview about Lala. Warmer water in the region where the storm formed and grew meant more juice. That's the whole mechanism in 4 words. NOAA's outlook for the Central Pacific this season called for 5 to 13 cyclones, well above the basin's normal quiet. So the pattern loaded the gun, the marine heat wave kept the powder dry, and the mountains aimed it. If that combination sounds unprecedented, It isn't, and this is where the story gets uncomfortable, because Hawaii has run this exact experiment before. August 2018. Hurricane Lane approached the islands from the south along a path almost nobody had seen before, stalled near the chain, and never made landfall. Its center stayed roughly 140 miles offshore. That's 4 times farther out than Lala got. Lane dropped 52.02 inches of rain on the town of Mountain View on the Big Island's eastern slopes. A gauge at Kahuna Falls measured 58. That set the Hawaii record for tropical cyclone rainfall, breaking a mark that had stood since Hurricane Hickey in 1950, and it made Lane the second wettest tropical cyclone ever recorded anywhere in the United States, behind only Harvey over Texas the year before. 58 inches, nearly 5 feet of water, delivered by a storm that stayed 140 miles away. Look at the two events side by side and a rule emerges that runs against everything the public has been trained to expect. In Hawaii, the storms that do the most damage are not the ones that hit. They're the ones that come close enough to point their moisture at the mountains and slow enough to keep pointing. A storm that makes landfall crosses the island and leaves. A storm that parks offshore keeps feeding the ramp for hour after hour after hour, and the ramp does the rest. Which brings me to the part of this I want to be careful about, because a lot of what you'll see about Lala over the next week is going to be wrong in specific, predictable ways. First, Lala did not hit Hawaii. Any headline saying a hurricane slammed the islands is describing something that didn't happen. There was no landfall. The eyewall stayed 30 miles off the southern tip. That distinction is not pedantry, and it's not a downgrade of what people in Cal went through. It's the single most important fact in the event because it tells you the damage came from water and terrain rather than from a direct wind strike, and that changes what you'd prepare for next time. Second, those 6 destroyed bridges. That figure was accurate as an initial assessment made from the air on Sunday while debris still covered everything. On Monday, after crews cleared mud, boulders, and downed trees, county officials went back and found that the bridges are structurally sound. Damaged, yes, not destroyed. Green's own words after the flyover were that the damage is not as catastrophic as they had feared. Kaala Stream, Keaiwa Stream, and Powwow Gulch had already reopened. Emergency access between Pahala and Hilo was restored along Route 11, single lane in places, 4-wheel drive recommended, essential travel only but restored. If you saw the Sunday number and never saw the Monday correction, you're carrying a version of this event that the people on the ground have already moved past. Third, and most important, the casualties. The early reporting on Saturday attributed a death to the storm, a 2-car collision in the Ocean View area. That crash killed a 45-year-old man and injured a young woman, and the fire department has since said it is not considered storm-related because it happened before the major impacts arrived. But there is a confirmed death. On Monday, the governor announced that officials had found the body of a 90-year-old woman who, in his words, perished in the flood. One person. In an event that put more than 3.5 feet of water on a mountainside above sleeping towns, tore a highway out from in front of a hospital, and floated occupied houses down a road in the dark. The temporary fire chief credited the resiliency of the island for how few injuries there were. I'd add something to that. The warnings worked. The emergency proclamation went out Friday. The hurricane warning went up before the rain. The particularly dangerous situation alert fired late Saturday while there was still time to move. Shelters were open 41 people in Naalehu, 13 in Pahala on the worst night, and around 400 across the islands at the peak. Whatever else this event was, it was a demonstration that a small population, warned early and warned specifically, can absorb a hit like this and come out the other side with a survivable toll. Fourth, on the climate question, because it deserves an honest answer rather than a slogan, warmer than normal water almost certainly increased Lala's rainfall. That's straightforward physics, since warmer air holds more water vapor. But Stephen Businger, a professor and former chair of atmospheric sciences at the University of Hawaii, has pointed out something that complicates the simple version. Look at sea surface temperature change over recent decades, and Hawaii sits in a pocket that has seen relatively little of it, while the fastest warming has happened at higher latitudes. And the relationship between El Niño and long-term warming is still not well understood. So the accurate statement is narrower than the one you'll see shared. This specific storm was fed by an anomalously warm ocean during a strengthening El Niño, and the rainfall was heavier for it. Whether Hawaii's hurricane risk is on a permanent upward slope is a separate question that the research hasn't closed. There's one more thing. Tom Giambaluca, the retired University of Hawaii professor who now oversees the island's network of weather stations, has flagged about all of this. Scientists used to describe the Big Island as a rock in the stream, an obstacle that forced storm-steering winds to go around it. The picture has gotten more complicated than that. The island's geography does protect parts of itself. But as Lala demonstrated, protection for one district is a fire hose aimed at another, and which side of that equation you end up on depends entirely on where the storm sits when it slows down. So what happens now? Power is the immediate problem. At the peak, more than 125,000 customers across the state were in the dark, most of them on the Big Island. By late Sunday, that was down to about 44,900, concentrated in Puna, North Kona, and South Kohala, still an entire mid-sized city's worth of meters with nothing coming through them. Crews have repaired 3 major transmission lines. But a spokesman for Hawaiian Electric has said out loud what nobody in those districts wanted to hear. Some rural customers could be without power for weeks, possibly months, because the transmission lines serving them run through terrain that is difficult to reach even on a good day, and right now it isn't a good day. The Department of Water Supply issued an essential needs-only notice: island-wide drinking, cooking, hygiene, nothing else, because the pumps depend on the same grid. Schools in Naalehu and Kau are going to be closed for some time. The governor described one school in Pahala in terms that suggested the building itself is a loss. Government offices and schools on Hawaii Island closed again Tuesday. About 70 National Guard soldiers and airmen are working the Kau district, going neighborhood by neighborhood. Shelter numbers are falling, from around 400 at the peak to about 100 by Monday night, and only a handful left in Pahala by Monday afternoon. The harder problem is the one the state is only starting to size up. A significant number of the destroyed structures were unpermitted, which means the people living in them may not qualify cleanly for the standard channels of disaster assistance, and many of them had no flood insurance to begin with. The Department of Human Services is scrambling for short-term rentals to house displaced families. The governor, who grew up in Kau, has said the state will fight for federal money to rebuild the public infrastructure. Whether individual households in that district get made whole is a much less certain thing, and it's the thread I'd watch over the next several weeks. And then there's the ocean, which has not changed. The marine heat wave is still there. The El Niño is still strengthening, with forecasters giving it better than a 9 in 10 chance of reaching very strong status through the fall and into winter. Central Pacific hurricane season runs through November. The seasonal outlook called for as many as 13 cyclones in this basin, and Lala was the 9th named storm, meaning the pattern that produced this weekend has months left to run over water that is still about 3 degrees too warm. The next system that forms out there will approach Hawaii under the same conditions that let this one keep its fuel. It may miss by 300 miles and mean nothing. It may miss by 30 and do this again. Watch for 2 specific things. The first is the Federal Disaster Declaration and what categories of assistance it covers, because that determines whether the families sitting in mud in Kau get help rebuilding or get a form letter. The second is the Climate Prediction Center's next El Niño update, and specifically whether that October through December window still carries a near-record designation, because if it does, the Pacific is going to keep making these, and the mountains above Naalehu haven't moved an inch. Subscribe and turn on the bell, because I'll be tracking both of those, and I'll be here the next time the ocean sends one of these toward a coastline that thought it was too far away to matter.